There is a classic mantra among cyclists that there are two kinds of people who ride bicycles, those who have crashed and those who are yet to crash. Accepting that crashing a bicycle is a part of riding a bicycle is something that's hard at first, but it's something a cyclist plans for simply by wearing a helmet. To take this kind of thinking to its highest level, that's when you start to get into the work and the world of disaster planners, people who have made it their life's work to help communities large and small plan for the day when something goes horribly, not if, when. My guest this week, Lucy Easthope, is a disaster planner. The lessons she has for us around assessing risk, accepting that awful things happening is a part of life, and how then to live every day knowing both of those things is pretty life-changing.
Disaster planners live differently. We live and love and laugh differently. We're not hedonistic. We tend to, we do have a pension fund, but we also know that today is there's no guarantee of tomorrow. We live as if life is very fragile. So my children never go off to school without me telling them how much I love them. We don't go off on a fight. You sense the fragility of life very differently. And also there's a lightheartedness in that. I think it's really important that, to embrace the day. And I genuinely believe that. I know it sounds trite, but it's really important to me.
Professor Lucy Easthope is a senior lecturer at the University of Lincoln, teaching fellow in mass fatalities and pandemics at the Centre for Death and Society, the University of Bath, a guest lecturer on emergency management programs at the universities of Leicester, Huddersfield, Dublin City, and Coventry. She knows what she's doing. Her wider training portfolio includes the legal aspects of emergencies, identifying the lessons post-incident, interoperability, and community resilience in practice. Lucy has developed contingency plans, training programs, and exercises with a number of organisations, including airports, airlines, government bodies, charities, universities, police services. She's also participated in the response to major incidents, including aviation disasters, the Bali terrorist attacks, and the operations at Breeze Norton during the military campaign in Iraq. She's written a book. It's called When the Dust Settles. It's a long journey, I guess, through her life's work, and it's page after page of lessons about how we might indeed live better and more fulfilling lives, not just under the threat of disaster, but also in the aftermath. She's a delightful human being, which is kind of surprising, and it might surprise you. It did me, because she's a person who has, in her career, her job has involved setting up post-disaster mortuaries, which can handle the corpses of thousands of victims. It's a truly wonderful book, and I am so grateful that Lucy made the time to speak with me. It's a conversation that I hope leaves you with a little more openness in your mind to the idea that when bad things happen is more appropriate and a far better way to live than if. And with that in your mind, how your day-to-day can just be a little bit more excellent. Enjoy this chat with Lucy. G'day, Lucy. How are you?
Good morning. Good evening for you. I'm very good, thank you.
Where in the world are you right now, Lucy?
I'm in my bedroom, actually. Normally I would record downstairs, but because of the time of day it is, there are two small children being packed off to school, which is a big theme of my work, is the constant battle between being a very professional, strong woman and getting two small children off to school.
But which country in the world are you in right now?
Oh, good question. Yes, I'm in the United Kingdom. I'm in the north of the United Kingdom, and yes, I'm very, very, very pleased to be here. But I'd like to be where you are. That looks lovely.
Oh, but our colonial overlords. Oh.
Hopefully more benign these days, but not always, as we may explore.
I know. It's a topic for another time, Lucy. It's certainly not about disaster preparedness or disaster recovery, but it's certainly interesting how the mindset of colonialism is still in existence and still, no, we're going to come over there and we're going to take your stuff and then we're going to make a lot of money off it. And sorry, you don't get to use it. That still happens
And
to
yeah,
us.
it actually has obviously huge relevance to disaster management at the moment. Yeah.
Oh, it's happening right now in Australia. We've got all these natural gas resources, which I don't personally agree with the fact that we're selling and burning, but the companies that take them from our country pay no tax. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Pardon, what? But that's kind of, it's still that vibe, It's like it's the 1600s all over again. It's
but with
weird
better
times.
Wi-Fi.
Yeah, any business model is good when your raw material costs nothing. Lucy, how far away would you say you are from the part of the world where you grew up right now?
Oh, yes. So that's a really important city to me. That's the world-renowned city of Liverpool. And now I moved during the pandemic. I'm about 40 minutes away from that wonderful place, which is very much who I am and at the heart of me. So I'm about 40 minutes, which is nothing in Australian time, to Liverpool. And although I don't actually live in the city, it will always have my heart.
And from reading your work, it's there's a particular incident in that city that I will never forget because I was old enough to understand what was happening. But there's a particular incident in your city that pretty much shaped your entire career. Oh,
absolutely, and that was where everything came from, really. And it's very interesting what you say, that it has global resonance. I think anybody who was alive, wherever they were in the world, has a memory of it. So it's 1989, the 15th of April, and it was a stadium crush at the Hillsborough football ground. And you have both the disaster on the day and then also the aftermath, and particularly how the community and the fans are treated in the aftermath. And my wonderful dad was very affected by what happened, and he was a teacher in Liverpool, and he had school kids at the game. And as the coverage, this state blaming of the fans just got worse and worse. I remember him saying, in his great sort of Scouse accent, somebody needs to sort this. And I took that as a direction. And I decided really from the earliest age that I was going to work in the aftermath of disaster. I think from the earliest age, I understood that things might happen, but why would we treat families so badly and with such contempt? And that was the start of the path, really.
Of course, I remember the Hillsborough disaster. And if you the quick version, I hope I'm not getting anything wrong, there was some like a cascade of mistakes that happened and some gates that got opened that shouldn't have been opened, and way too many people tried to get into a already overfull stadium.
Yeah, so the final death toll is 97. And what happened was a person died after, and then a further person died a few years after. And then the death toll actually got amended to 97 this year when the final person who'd been in a very severely injured state died. And it was just, as you say, it was this catastrophic series of failures. And those failures are often pretty unforgivable. But what makes it worse, and of course it's something, as I say, in my book, it's something I've seen so often, is that the state sort of turns on the people most affected. And that's just awful to see. And it's not an unusual encounter for me after disaster at all. So the fans were blamed for forcing the opening of the gate, which they hadn't done.
Yeah, and this is not uncommon, unfortunately, certainly in crowd crush disasters. That was the photographs. If you've ever seen any of the photographs of this or any of the footage, it's absolutely harrowing. Of course, it's a football game. There's 20 cameras in the field, right? And so a lot of it is documented quite in a harrowing way. And as a young man going to gigs, I remember both my parents were doctors and they had studied in the UK, or my mum studied in the UK. And when she saw this go down in Liverpool and she knew I was starting to go to concerts, she would always tell me, like, the moment you can't get your hands away from your chest, go backwards, whatever. However good the band is, I don't care, go backwards if you can. And that always stuck with me. And I was working on a festival here called The Big Day Out when a young woman died, actually. And it was a crush, and it was horrendous because it's so completely powerless. Because when else do you get thousands of people together when they're either they're all there at something that they want to be at?
Yeah,
generally.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that is there's always a sort of privilege. A part of my work is seeing the work, for example, now that goes into stewarding and event safety. And one of the themes that I weave in is sort of as a young woman funding my way through university was to sort of become a security guard at events, and you go on training to monitor the crowd, and you're there to support. And I think one of the things, it's terrible when things improve or things are taught, but really that was such a shock to the world that it has hopefully transformed some aspects of crowd safety for in memory. It was totemic enough, but it's really, really difficult. It's a constant challenge in crowd and safety management.
Oh yeah, and I've heard that in many other ways. I've heard it in like every safety rule here is written in blood. I've heard that on a factory floor.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
And I've also I like scuba diving with my wife, and when you go through the dive tables of how long you can go and the decompression tables, you're like, people died to get this data.
Yeah,
people died horrible decompression sickness deaths to figure out that 42 minutes was about as long as you could go at this depth, and it's harrowing. This stuff exists, but it is your work focuses a lot on what happens after, because this is the world we live in. We can't just get up and go to greener pastures. That causes all kind of other problems. Many times, communities or places they can't relocate. At what point does someone like you get a phone call?
Well, it can vary hugely. And, a large part of my work actually is the planning and the training for things that may never happen. The last few years we've seen most of them, but certainly a lot of the time, and this was a sort of part, I think, of being in another world, really, in a world that the public didn't see, is that you spend an awful lot of your time not getting a phone call and planning for things that don't happen. Yeah. And then I've worked at times where a call has come in much before the news, actually, and sometimes, again, calls have come in for things that didn't materialise. So I've been in situations where an airline has had a mayday from a pilot and rung for assistance from a disaster management company, and hasn't necessarily needed us, thank goodness. But generally at the moment, it comes by, like everything really in life, it comes by somebody who's worked with me before, sends me either a WhatsApp or a text message and says, I think we're going to need you in a strategic coordinating group. And, I wait to be asked. And so it usually comes in about 48 hours after the event. I'm much more networked now, and I think the pandemic has really helped explain, and obviously writing about it in When the Dust Settles has explained a lot more about the role of recovery. I get a lot of senior commanders now saying, we definitely ring you straight away. But that's not always been the case. And the sad thing is when you're called too late, really, to come and get involved. Because what the whole theme of my work is that mistakes made in the early response can have a huge effect on individual families and people and communities. And that if I can head those off, we can perhaps help towards a better recovering. But that involves being asked from the start. So it's a delicate balancing act.
You do a lot of work with not only private companies or organisations like I'm guessing sporting leagues and things like that, but also local, state, federal governments, national governments. In your experience, is acceptance of the fact that as much as we don't want bad things to happen, bad things are going to happen. In fact, they're more likely to happen than not happen. And at some point, hundreds of people will die, probably on a really lovely day in your city or town. The acceptance that this is a fact, is that a hard thing for people who you're working with to kind of get their head around?
I think at strategic level, it's a very hard thing. At operational level with fellow emergency planners, it's something we're very... we will never be comfortable with it, but it's certainly there in our language and our planning. But at strategic level, no, it's never easy to convey that. And certainly now, I think we live in a world, certainly in the Western kind of developed world, where these things are not expected to happen. So you're immediately facing a tide of why, and quite rightly so, for all the reasons I've just explained. I want those questions as to how on earth did this happen. One very simple trick, and I think one of the things about When the Dust Settles is you see me writing about how I'm being schooled. I don't go into this going, these are the lessons from disaster recovery. These are Lucy kind of learning hard all the time. And one of the things that I learned very early on to say when I was planning or training was when. the disaster occurs, when the plane crashes, when the building collapses. And because if you say if, you're kind of buying them out of planning for it. So it's when. And, it's quite confronting, that idea. And generally in meetings all of the time, I'm introducing ideas that you can see are causing quite a lot of confrontation to the room. And that, the one you've outlined there is probably one of the biggest, that actually, these things do happen. I think because we here in the United Kingdom, we don't have a same sort of set of geographical hazards that say Australia or New Zealand have. A lot of our failings are socio-technical and theoretically very preventable. So it is difficult to sell the idea, and should we? That's a question itself of the inevitability. And one of the highest national risk for the world next year will be a global flu pandemic. But good luck to me for trying to sell that at the moment. That's the difficulty. It will sit at the top of our national risk register as the highest risk, but nobody's really got the appetite apart from the planners to worry about it.
Yeah. You mentioned something really fascinating. Lucy, your job is to help communities plan ahead for when disaster happens, not if, but when. Now, a lot of people listening, they're not in the business of helping a government plan for when the earthquake happens or when the tsunami hits or, when the plane crashes. But through our day, through our planning of our life or when our kids are going to school or something like that, how can we learn from that? How can we not use the words if when we're planning for tricky things that we'd want to avoid and start using the words when? What can we learn from that?
It's a double, it is a double-edged sword. One of the conclusions I've come to at this age is not everybody has to live like a disaster planner. I'm quite happy that people just sort of in many ways carry on with their lives. I think there's a middle ground, and I actually find that my Australian friends are much closer to where, good preparedness is than my UK friends, because you have, different geological hazards, and you have things like people would, if they were driving to friends across a large swathe of the outback, you would plan differently. When I meet with my Australian friends, I often find that they think we here are quite poor at preparing ourselves as families, and we're quite poor at talking about risk in a different way. I think even your wildlife is something that we couldn't imagine having here. And you build a culture, your school children are trained and schooled slightly differently. And that's where I would like us to get to. I do think we have missold, particularly to our youth, the idea that, work hard and life's great, and we've sort of stripped out the ideas of being ready for difficult things. And I certainly see a move to that here, a bit more preparedness about things like first aid. And certainly, I think as things get tougher economically, looking out for each other differently. We've just had a major series of storm reports into some storms that we had in the winter that have shown just how unprepared we are for things like the loss of overhead power. So there's things I would like to do. But I'm also comfortable, and it's something I've really explored in analysing myself, that maybe, I am, and my tribe are a bit different from other people. With national government, there's certainly no excuse, so with them, I'm much tougher.
Yeah.
And, there's an anger and a slightly sort of scathing view that, I have about, these things were perfectly predictable: flooding, fire, the pandemic. These were all predictable risks. They were all well planned for. And the only failure in the chain is when it's almost impossible to convince national leaders that there's a problem. And you, like us, have a quite short electoral cycle. And so, something like antibiotic resistance, climate change, pandemic planning needs 20-year commitment. And you can't do that with governments that are just, we're likely to have an early 2024 election. So, it's what policies will sell in 16 months. You're certainly not going to do, your major push for antibiotic resistance. So it's very difficult. And I've reached the age where I'm really reflecting, I think, on how to sell some of these messages at national level. And it shouldn't be this hard.
Yeah.
And it is. It's hard as what's called a wild card in disaster planning to sell the opposite view, and it's also hard as a woman to sell the response, because we look hysterical if we're not careful.
Oh my God, both of those reasons suck. um, but we have a phrase here, which I'm sure you've heard. We have a phrase here, NIMBY, not in my backyard. We have a phrase here, NIMTO, not in my term of office.
Yeah, I'm stealing that. That's brilliant. That's exactly the problem we have here. Yeah, I love it.
It's all yours.
Thank
and we
you.
saw it here. We have a 3-year election cycle, which is
crikey. You get nothing done in
please
that.
do. We have a 3-year election cycle, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so you saw we had an election on the 21st of May. You saw people dropping policy on the first of April. They were seeing like what can get them over the line in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Not in 6 years.
Yeah.
Not in 16 years.
No.
And it's so short-sighted.
Yeah. Absolute.
And it's
Same here.
extraordinarily difficult. What makes us as humans so shit at assessing risk, Lucy?
Oh, again, this is my beautiful denouement to the end of the chapter, the fear. I think one of the things that I do think our ancestors would have sort of looked at us slightly, kind of mystified, is the idea that bad things don't happen. I think that's a very kind of, certainly an English privilege, and only to a certain sector of the population. We live in a terribly racialized, marginalized, unequal population here. And we often do some of our worst things to those with the least resources to cope with it. So that isn't a population that needs to be told that you're not planning for the worst, because really what we see there is the disasters that we inflict on them are just a further crisis in an already kind of oppressive state of affairs. But there was certainly a swathe, and it really kind of proved our theory during the pandemic that couldn't make sense. Although I don't think any of us could make sense of the risk material that was coming out of the government, and then couldn't calibrate, again through no fault of their own, like what they needed to do with it. And that was the pandemic really has been the sum of all of our fears around how people manage risk and understand risk. And also I think we thought we were doing it for the greater good, but actually the amount of selfish kind of focus on one's own survival, coupled with some amazing community resilience, and that's the sort of the two worlds I live in. Sometimes I see terrible things, sometimes I see good things. The way I keep going is to focus on the good things. So you saw amazing kind of care and community resilience, coupled with complete unawareness that people were like, stay in, get your food delivered by a person who's delivering your food. We completely forgot a whole swathe of our population, and that just blew my mind, really. So I've actually one of the things I'm really proud of for next year is an anthology of poems and scripts and diaries of just how unequal the pandemic proved the United Kingdom to be, which is well known to disaster planners.
Oh, it happened here as well. It was like I'm a former roadie, and so I actually got a roll on my, because I still never travel without a roll of gaff tape. All right, still always take a roll of gaff tape with me.
About
and
that. Good.
The way I used to describe it was that, where's his gaff? I'm a disaster planner. There's going to be a moment where we need to tape something. And if we don't have cloth back tape, we're fucked.
Yeah.
It's all right. Ginsberg's here. The way I felt the pandemic, certainly in this country, it just, bits of the way our society was functioning were kind of all held together by gaff. All right. There was the part where the social services that the government provided were here. Then there was the people that were here. And then there was like, well, we're just gonna stretch. Yeah, it works fine. No problem. Everything's fine. And then when the pandemic hit, boom, all that gaff got pulled away, and then things just stopped connecting, and that really, really showed the cracks. You mentioned something earlier, and similarly in the pandemic, maybe I didn't look, but I certainly didn't see fights over toilet paper in Japan. So I'm wondering, in your experience as someone who's in disaster preparation and certainly, disaster recovery and how to, help a community after that, what have you noticed between individualistic societies like the one we live in Australia and in the UK and in America versus communal societies or somewhere like Japan, where it's or parts of Africa where it's like, I am because we are. I think the word is Ubuntu. I think. What have you noticed about how disaster response, particularly from the communities before and after, changes?
Yeah, And there's a huge amount to learn as we do try to do from communities that are much more, perhaps, like Japan is much more comfortable with drilling and preparing for emergency management. I mean, one of the things, and as I keep saying, it gives me my smiles, is that humans are great and people are great. And, I have got through this pandemic only prouder, actually, of my operational people, my country, not my leaders, but my country. I'm very, very proud of, because there were some things where I do, I say in my book, I like challenge, I like rebellion, I like dissent, I don't want to necessarily see compliance all of the time. People thought that I must be devastated that immediately, there was a lot of challenge on social media to government policies. I'm proud of living in a nation that's able to do that. I also think, we explored a lot my original path into disaster, and that comes from there's a healthy skepticism to the message that you're being given by the state. And yes, I think we saw some stockpiling of loo roll, but what we also saw was loo roll is the first thing to go in a supply chain. It takes up huge amounts in a lorry. So supermarkets didn't have enough loo roll to sell, and they focused on what were considered more priority goods. And one of my suspicions, and I do go there in When the Dust Settles, is by the time we got certainly to the UK in 2019-20, we were a country we'd slightly lost our relationship with the truth, and we were using a lot of behavioural insight to tell people how to respond in emergencies. And my suspicion is, there's no real evidence that we saw huge amounts of panic buying. What we saw was probably, oh my goodness, somebody else has got a 16-pack of loo roll in the trolley, I'll do the same. So we saw actually what looks like collective behaviour. And then the second thing that we saw was this, and we always knew this would happen. We had a lot of data from other disasters that this would happen. A lot of the country are in some way engaged in disaster response. So health workers, funeral directors, emergency planners, police, fire, ambulance. And it was obvious in sort of end of Feb, early March that something was emerging. So if you were married to a contingency planner, you'd go and stock up, which was exactly what we'd seen post-hurricane and post-tornadoes, like the spouses of police workers going out and stocking up because word was this is bad. And I think there was a scandal where, sort of American senator's wife had been briefing the other senators to go shopping. This is what you do. This is good preparedness. So I felt very sorry, actually, for British and American and Australian publics at that point. We told them to prepare. We told them to get ready. And then when they did, we accused them of panic buying. So this is where I'm what's called the wild card. And I've just actually been formally voted a wild card in the UK Health Service, which was a very big honour bestowed on me by the Health Service Journal, which was she asks difficult questions of policymakers. So it's, I'm hoping there's a badge and it's official. But one of the things is I was quite distressed by some of the hounding of how the public were behaving. And one of my dearest friends is an Australian nurse, and we were keeping in touch throughout. And you saw exactly what we saw: just amazing people keeping going, eye on a horizon. Let's get our children through. It wasn't always possible with some of the policies, but I got huge comfort from that. So, yeah, I learn a lot from other places, but I also take huge amounts from our own country's resilience during these times.
You mentioned turning against the people, pointing fingers at those who've grabbed all the toilet paper they can, even though we told them prepare. I think the first. Well, we're talking about the pandemic, but this is only just as a way to frame the kind of, I guess, the psychology, or the next question I want to ask you is, I think like the first weekend when it was like, this is a pandemic, there were 13,000 people on Bondi Beach.
Yeah.
And there was all these photos going, how dare you, people are going to die and you just think you just want to be out in the sun. And I had a guest on my podcast, Briggs, he's an amazing guy, and he said 13,000 people didn't go to the beach because out of spite. They went to the beach because it wasn't communicated to them clearly enough, and there wasn't enough leadership to say, this is why we need you to stay home. So in your work, where does coaching leaders in communication come in?
That's a huge point and a huge part of it, and a source of huge sadness. I every day work with amazing crisis leaders and amazing, people going above and beyond that people just don't see. Call it the bricolage, the hidden work of disaster planning, and it frustrates me intensely that they should be as brilliant as they are, and people on massive salaries and massive status in society do not give the same value to the skills that they show. And one of the things we have, again, it comes back to your not in my term of office, is how they prioritise their training. So, one of the contrasts I see now to when I started in the early 2000s is, the first thing you would do with a new cabinet and a new minister and a new prime minister was that they would go on training. And they would train how to do the Cabinet Office briefing room, and they would train how to do comms. And also, I think you would agree there is no one true science, but you would perhaps open up the science and technical briefings to the whole Houses of Parliament. Those were the sorts of things you would do. And now, we've got rail strikes here, and they were sort of, the ministers were boasting about how many Cabinet Office briefing room meetings, which are the way we handle crisis and disaster, would be activated. And it just feels like it's all a sort of political tool. The other thing that I'd written a lot about was that ultimately disasters are about people and compassion and what humans need. And, I haven't had access to the very top level briefings of January, February, March 2020, but were our leaders spending enough time on what it's going to feel like to be, say, a parent trying to get children through this? Did they spend enough time on making sure that we could still get to the people at end of life in a hospital? Did they make enough time to think about maybe we can't hold funerals, but what else will we do? And, both in the UK and Australia, the records will show that they didn't. So, the types of training and also the time for the training are really important. And, will we get better now? I really hope so. I mean, you've just had a quite fundamental shift of government in Australia. You'd like to think that the first days in office, they would ask to see the risk register. They would ask to know when the training's in their diary for a major incident, something on the scale of, the Japanese tsunami and, the triple disasters, things that throw in, other threats and hazards. Yeah. When are they being trained? And, one thing that's frustrated me hugely at some of the inquiries we've got going on at the moment is there's been no focus on, could you tell me, Minister, when you were trained in strategic leadership for disaster? We haven't asked that, for example, in the Grenfell fire, which killed at least 72 people. We haven't asked that question of our ministers. But my thinking and my understanding is they were so new in office, they won't have been trained.
So let's say, you've got, and you did mention there's been a fundamental ideological shift in Australian politics, which is, I think we're all still having our exhale sigh. A month later, we still can't believe it happened. In your experience, what communication, what messaging from leaders is received well and helps victims of a disaster take those next steps? What works for people who have been affected by disasters? What words work from a leader?
And the really difficult thing is it's very hard to do that in the heat of the moment. So the best, obviously, as we were just saying, the best thing to do is to get to them before and plan and train and work with them and challenge them. One of the hardest things about my life has been going in to challenge a message that leaders are putting out at the time. And actually, I've learned it's probably incredibly unhelpful, and I just have to let it play out because that's a completely febrile time. So the best scenario there is that I've had some time with them before the incident, and they absolutely believe you get this sort of zealous commitment that what they're doing is the right thing. So your Bondi Beach example is really interesting. How to get the sweet spot in a leadership message about, get in, stay in, people are dying, versus you can go to the beach if you want to, as a spectrum. The problem that everybody did here in the UK in the early few months was the get in, stay in. Do you really want to be responsible for killing your grandma? And in disaster recovery planning, that was almost as harmful as the other end of the spectrum, probably as harmful if I was being really honest. They never found the middle ground, which is we would like you to stay in, this is why, and a sort of calm, measured, with perhaps a little bit of uncertainty, but for us, stay in, not loading in loads of fear and not loading in loads of guilt, because what the disaster research had shown was that would have a very long-term effect on society and recovery. And you see these massive polarizations, which we're certainly living through, accusing people who perhaps kept their business open once they were allowed to, or accusing people who campaigned like I did to reopen safe spaces for children as being very selfish in that, you know, you didn't care about the virus. And of course we cared about the virus, and the virus, you know, was a terrible threat. But we also, as disaster planners, had this broad spectrum of where the risk would go, and that there were other things that are equally harmful, really, to a recovering community. And this was lessons that we learned from things like environmental contamination. So in flooding, for example, we saw local authorities really, really kind of overhype the risk of E. coli from the floodwater, which is definitely a risk. But it meant that people then were so sort of turned against their objects in their own home that once the floodwater had receded, they would throw out their passports and their documents and things that could be wiped clean. And, you know, the fear of contamination and disease, it really lingers, and it's very hard to row back on. So what I would ideally do is get to leaders before the incident, and you can work through this. And, you know, I'm doing one in 2 days. You know, we're spending a day with senior leaders, and we'll play scenarios. And they're skeptical. They'll look at you and think, no, that won't be a problem. But it certainly gives them pause for thought. And I think one of the things with When the Dust Settles is people have come to me and said, my boss has read it now, and he or she is much happier letting me run with some of my challenges to some of their messaging. And that's something I could only have dreamed of that I'd initiate. So I'm really pleased with that. So yeah, it's very difficult to get the balance right, and also to tell a leader that they're doing too much.
Yeah.
They're perhaps over-promising.
Yeah.
They're running support services 24 hours a day, these kind of things. One campaign I'm really proud of recently with Ukraine is I went well above the parapet and reminded our country of a lesson that it already knew, which is the best type of donation in disaster is cash, not stuff. And I went really loud and really prominent, and within 24 hours, I got a text message from a friend who works with the London mayor and said, there's a press statement going out, you know, donations of money, not donations of stuff. So sometimes you can correct the message, but it's very hard.
Why, after a disaster, cash, not stuff? Why?
With few exceptions, and the kind of, you know, I got accused of being a fence sitter the other day, and I'll take that accusation. There are times when I'll deviate from my own own advice. For example, you know, if somebody says we really need crutches after an incident that's caused a lot of broken legs, I'll let a donation of crutches. You know, somebody's made the case for that. Apparently, everybody stockpiles crutches at home. But generally, what we find, and that, you know, huge amounts again of disaster research. Remember, it's like a field of scholarly, ethnographic, observational, qualitative studies. Is that stuff is the secondary disaster. So, you know, out of date medical goods, sending nice warm jumpers as we did from here to the tsunami in the Indian Ocean. We basically just send rubbish, and it becomes the second disaster. It sits in containers and moulders. Unless there is a very specific requirement, as I say, that's very clearly evident, the best thing you can do is donate to an organised charity. And I was really pleased here with Ukraine. We moved swiftly. It was looking perilous. So yeah, with few exceptions, my hashtag is cash, not stuff.
I love it. But speaking of stuff, though, we have wild associations and wild emotional attachments to stuff. My roll of gaff, my phone, a photo of my wedding day, my kids' toys, my eldest's makeup mirror, like these things. What have you learned about going back to this place that is your home, your safe place, your sanctuary, and seeing little things? It might be a toothbrush that then just sets you in this just psychological path of devastation that is so hard to recover from. How do you help people go through that part?
Oh gosh, I think that's been one of the most humbling parts of my life and my work, really. It's what Kai Erikson, the disaster sociologist, calls the loss of the furniture of self. So it is everything that makes us up. And one of the proudest chapters in When the Dust Settles is about flooding. And I think it's been a really unifying thing between me and my brethren in Australia and New Zealand and the US, is that you flood and we flood, and the experience is very similar. So I could find you, right now, 25 mothers who've told me the same story from Hull or Doncaster or Durban or, Christchurch after the earthquakes created a sort of liquefaction, a horrible mud that covered everything. And one word I use a lot to describe this is hiraeth, the Welsh word for a lost life, a life that you can't return to. And even the idea that you're perhaps living in the same house, but it's lost something, it's lost its sense of safety. And this was something where, I say what you learn in disaster is not all of these things are neatly framed within traditional concepts of recovery management, or so we have, big firms that will go in and clear this up. And also it wasn't neatly framed within mental health. The person who's going through that is very exhausted. There's a malaise, there's a sadness. So they might be given antidepressants and some cognitive behavioural therapy. But actually, perhaps even when that garage is cleaned, they go in and in their mind's eye, all they see is that it's destroyed or something is changed. And so a lot of my work, and actually some of my proudest work, is about the care and management of personal effects. Now, with homes, we see something very different. We see a huge sense of pain and exhaustion. My other relationship with personal effects is often after things like bombs and air crashes, how we return those to the bereaved and from survivors. They will perhaps, for example, they'll mount. I've seen artwork made out of the things that they were perhaps wearing on the day that it happened. But with bereaved families, one of my greatest achievements really that I'm really proud of is that in the UK we've really built an ethic of care around the return of personal items to people who've lost things in disaster. We don't always apply that to the flooding and the fires, but one of the things that I will always get in very early on with those strategic leaders is what's happening about the personal effects, and that's one of those examples where I'm regularly told off. I'm regularly told it's not important. And I really have to make that case.
Is it because when we lose someone close to us, if, someone then says, oh, and this is the necklace that we retrieved, we can hold that thing and something in our psychological mechanism goes, all right, I'm accepting that this person is gone now because I have this thing, and I would only have this thing because that I know that plane crashed, and when they went through the wreckage, they found this, and so therefore she or he was definitely on board, and there's closure. Then is that why it feels better?
That's a huge part of it. Often with plane and helicopter crashes and things like that, and bomb explosions, there's very little of the person that we can return, and we will try and do viewing. And I'm a huge advocate of never censoring what a loved one is allowed to see, but sometimes there's very little to return. But the personal effects will survive in a different way. Often, as you say, jewellery or a debit card is surprisingly indestructible. We'll be able to get a SIM card off a phone, all of these kinds of things. And they do exactly what you say. There's a confirmation, they were there, which is a huge part of 9/11, which I write about, where, up to 40% of people have no biological confirmation really that their loved one was involved. I know of people who only got a partial debit card back. Those are the kinds of things. And of course, people do live with sort of fantasy and story that maybe the person survived. The year of 9/11 was the year that the movie Castaway had come out before, and people had this idea that maybe people had swum to Staten Island, or maybe they were in a hospital, or they'd got sort of blown out to safety, all of these kind of things. So the personal effects are hugely confirmatory. I think one of the things that I've had a real response to with writing the book is people saying, I never even thought that there was somebody like you who made sure that, the personal effects had gone off to a team to be cared for, and then the families are given choice. That's hugely important to me. The items can be returned as close to the condition that they were in the disaster as possible. We don't launder or repair without permission. And people haven't found that grisly or distressing. They've thought, wow, to know that I live in a world where there's a personal effects contract so that somebody will always take care of them. It's hugely important. You have it written into your transportation codes in Australia. You mirror actual formal statute in America, and it's one less thing for the families to have to worry about. Because what we were seeing in the 1990s, one of the reasons the Americans passed legislation was that a group of families went to a briefing on the crash, and they went to where the wreckage was being examined, and they looked in some skips, and they could see, big rubbish skips. They could see the personal effects. And that goes right back to my ethos at the start. I might be able to understand that disaster has happened, but I will never understand the treatment of families that's that poor. So I will do everything I can to prevent that.
We touched on the differentiation between using the word when and using the word if. And at the start of your career, you may have been aware, I think the 80s, I think the Montreal thing was happening around CFCs. We had an idea of global warming, had an idea of ice caps melting. It was kind of this thing. And 92, the Kyoto Protocol shows up and went, oh, yeah, that's far away. I'm recording this. I'm on the, 30-something floor of a building 100 metres from the high tide mark, and the ground floor of this building is probably 1.5 metres above sea level. And that goes the entire plain behind me all the way to the mountains. And there's a sense of dread that's coming across my body when I think about what this place will look like in 30 or 40 years. Lucy, what can a community like this, like a vulnerable coastal community, what can a community like this start to think about now? Difficult things. What can they start to think about now so that whatever happens, they will still feel at home somewhere? They will still feel like their neighbours are the neighbours. They will still feel, oh no, I identify culturally with this particular area. You mentioned you live 40 minutes away from Liverpool. I'm sure it feels very different to be there just because of the people that live around you. That's why you choose to live there. So it feels, I grew up in Queensland. This feels completely different to where I live in Sydney. All right? Yeah. That sense of feeling, that sense of place, that sense of belonging is so important. That's a big question, but as far as planning for that, what are some things that we can start to think about now that we might want to put in place?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question.
To make sure that it's okay, we know.
Yeah, that's and actually, a good place to answer it, because I've just done a keynote for the University of College London's Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, and I was quite feisty in it because I think the majority of presentations that you go to on climate change, particularly in the scholarly environment, are quite future focused. So if we don't do this, we will do that. And I was quite struck by it, and very similar actually, not knowing you were going to ask me that question. I started it with the when not if question. I could see the room being like, well, that's a bit defeatist, Lucy Easthope, that you're saying, right, so when this town disappears, when this island, some of the Pacific Islands goes, what do we do? And you could see because the room was great. It was early career researchers. It was very, very animated. I could see, I was on rocky ground, because that's a bit defeatist. But actually, when you talk in the language of disaster planning, which is very affirmative, very certain, this will happen, this tower block will burn down, this will be under sea level, what next? And I'd been watching a news report here for a community that was planning to move its village from the coastal edge here in the UK, sort of 10 metres backwards, so that the village and the community and what we call the kind of lifescapes of the community would endure. It would just be in a slightly different place. And this was a big discussion we had, for example, with the Grenfell fire. Was one of the early things I mooted, and maybe I'm pleased that I never got listened to, because I'd now be responsible for the complete destruction of Her Majesty's grass. But one of the things that I suggested was, rather than spread the 200 families that needed homes across London, what about if we built an enormous, very, very nice lodge park that we'd seen done in New Zealand or in America? Would that work? And it was completely poo-pooed. And as I say, maybe that was the right thing. But the idea of the protected lifescape, Canterbury and Christchurch in New Zealand are a huge example of what happens when you say that place no longer exists. For the geological reasons, the seismic reasons, some places are now inaccessible. You don't get to take that pain away. I speak to wonderful colleagues in Christchurch, and at the 10-year point, the 11-year point, it's still absolutely incredibly painful. And the hiraeth, the Welsh word, that loss of the life before, hurts more than ever. So one of the things I said in the presentation is climate adaptation will all be about hiraeth. And you'll be expected to just sort of power through that. Oh, I'm very sorry, that island doesn't exist anymore. That my children caught a little bit of Waterworld the other day, that well-known blockbuster with Kevin Costner. And my little one said, oh, is this about climate change? She thought it was a documentary. She got so used to kind of, the David Attenborough Blue Planet kind of discussion. She was like, "Oh, is that 2035?" And my husband and I were like, "Well, crikey, yes, I suppose it is." And when she went to bed that night, she said to me, "How long before you have to swim down to the town?" And that's,
wow.
I think one of the things I would like us to shift towards is not an acceptance that there's nothing we can do. I get that, but an acceptance of the use of when, and preparing communities for rapid change. On the same day as I did my presentation, there was, it's always a privilege. I was listening to some researchers from Uganda, and that was, they are quite rightly pointing out, some of this is very Western privilege to sit here and kind of debate it. They are living with starvation, and they are living with massive changes climatically. And so one of the things I think many of us in the disaster management world are saying, what skills do we have that can be immediately applied to this debate? And the biggest one is talking as when, not if.
Because yes, there's the days after the thing, there's the weeks after the thing, there's the months after the thing, and then there's the years after the thing, and eventually that'll be a thing that happened, But the idea of lifescape, that's a fascinating thing. Keeping a community together is one of the things that social cohesion is one of the things that keeps our society as it is. It keeps that balance there, and it's so vitally important. I mean, we've seen what happens when things fall to bits. When nobody wants that. Thankfully, it's all happening in slow motion in some parts of the world. My wife, you mentioned the Pacific Islands. My wife's from Fiji, and I did a couple of years in a row working over there. And boy, you see villages getting, parts of villages that don't exist anymore. Like it's happening. When it's happening in your day, you're like, all right, I guess we'll move your house over there, but we can at least all stay together. But here, it's like, it's far away. Don't worry about it. But it isn't, and where there's so much resistance against it because, property values are important. Absolutely.
And I think also one of the things I called out in this presentation was we've learned a lot from the pandemic about how you convey risks. It's not always clear what to do. Your personal adaptations can feel very, very meaningless. We've had big scandals here where people have been diligently recycling and then they've just found out it's actually being burnt as landfill. People are desperately trying to make ethical choices about every stage of their life and sustainable choices about every stage of their life, but the science isn't clear. So in my world, I deal a lot with death planning. I'm a mass fatality planner as part of the disaster work. And I've just come back from a very inspiring burials and cremations conference, which was entirely focused on environmental change. And they say that, some of the family members now will often be very focused on sustainability, what emissions and what changes can they make. But these can feel quite small when you look at, say, the amount of, big industrial pollutants going on. So I think one of the difficulties is how to make difference. And I've really enjoyed the sort of change we've seen in the media in the last couple of years about real meaningful changes we can make. And then I think the other thing is calling out the hypocrisy. Climate change activists who fly back and forth to conferences all around the world is really rankling now, I think. And that's always been the sort of hypocrisy of some of the, the global movements. The workers are noticing this while they're being lectured from very luxury environments on climate change. So we've got to find a way to equal the discussion, I think, as well. That was another big issue for me.
It is hard, but these things, and it's tough to have those kind of conversations with your kids. No doubt, I'm sure even you would have a hard time answering that question to a little one. What are some ways that you've learned that is, can be effective when communicating to kids around a disaster, the when, but also if something bad has happened, and a disaster could be a car crash that, you lose half your family. And what have you learned lessons about, communicating to children about things like this?
Personally, what I always am very motivated by, and I deliberately started when the dust settles with my own child activism, being 11 and realising that the state has got this very wrong. There's a wonderful group that meets in North Kensington called the Futurehood Children, which are aged 5 to 11. And we run seminars and they ask questions, and we are careful sometimes, that you end on a hopeful note, you calibrate what the children can cope with, but you answer their questions. And so that's really important to me, is seeing them as equal citizens. It is difficult, my little one particularly is very interested in the world, and you don't want to turn that into fear. Certainly the climate change conversations, you can see her being very worried. Will we drown? Where will the water come? And so, one of the things is definitely a balance. And one thing I always say is that disaster planners live differently. We live and love and laugh differently. We're not hedonistic. We tend to, we do have a pension fund, but we also know that today is there's no guarantee of tomorrow. We live as if life is very fragile. So my children never go off to school without me telling them how much I love them. We don't go off on a fight. You sense the fragility of life very differently. And also there's a lightheartedness in that. I think it's really important that, to embrace the day. And I genuinely believe that. I know it sounds trite, but it's really important to me. The big thing I found with the pandemic was to get them to look outwards. The UK can be quite a selfish, privileged nation again. We can look in on ourselves. How is this affecting me? And I said to them, my goodness, there's littler people than you. There's babies. We've got to get through this. There's people who need help around the corner, and they had jobs all through the pandemic. And so looking outwards and altruism and, thinking about getting us through this. And we live in a multi-generational family, lots of grandparents are very, very close by. That was one of the reasons we moved. So it's always, how do we get people through this? And that's been a real motivator to them.
I guess what you're saying is almost quite I dare say Buddhist in a way, just accepting that life is pain, accepting that life is suffering, accepting that it's a when, not an if, that everyone will die and everything you love will turn to rubble or dust or ash or mud. Once you're in acceptance of that, you're free to go, well, I better have fun now.
I know, I don't want to be responsible for a wave of total hedonism across Australia, but I think there is a spiritual, theological aspect to disaster planning, which is, some of my greatest mentors are in things like mortuary management and funeral directing and also, theologians, is that, it doesn't stop us focusing on making sure we build the best future. There is a balance here, and I'm very, very comfortable with that. But sometimes I also say, take comfort in the fact that there are disaster planners and climate scientists and lots of people doing great work, and you make sure you're doing your bit, but also live for today. I think this massive worry that I see, it leads to a very stultifying, very paralyzing fear and anxiety. One of the things that I've been really touched by with the response to the book is that people said, oh, phew, of course, I never thought about it, but of course, a society would have disaster planners. That makes me feel so much better. And our government, I think, to get itself out of various holes, has started to sell the idea of things as being unprecedented. It's something I really call out on Twitter. If a minister ever uses unprecedented, expect a Lucy pylon. These things are planned for.
Yeah.
The other thing, again, in your not in my term of office, we started to try and sell the idea to the public that, vote for me, there'll be no death. So one of the things I'm raising big questions about is, what is life for, and how does it end? Yeah. And then there's been some lovely reviews of the book that have said, these are big theological questions here. What are we here for, and what were we trying to prevent? And that some things, come with death. We had a big debate here recently because our minister said, well, we might get power outages, but we're completely on top of it and completely in control, because we've got major issues with power in the country at the moment. Don't worry about it. And actually, our publicly available National Risk Register sets the likelihood of power outages as very high, and with a predicted death toll from things like cold in your own home of 1,000 people. So let's be honest, it's there, and I can download it right now. It's not a private document. Why can't we say to the public, these are the things we would like you to do to get ready for that. Look after thy neighbour, be ready for community warming spaces. We'll go through all this, by the way, while you're having Christmas on the beach. So it's all very difficult. If we have a tough winter, these are the things I want you to do. That's good preparedness. And so there's a strange mix, I think, of spirituality meets jolly good sense. And that's what disaster planning is all about.
If there was a church of spirituality that meets jolly good sense, I think I would go every week, because the songs would also be pretty good.
The planthams.
But I think
disaster planners.
Yeah, the planthams. I love it. But I was explaining to Wolfie, because we're in this high-rise building, right? And I took Wolfgang, he's nearly 3, and it's very exciting because we don't take the bins out, we go to the chute, and we put the bin in the chute, and then we listen as it goes 30-something floors all the way. Dum, there it is, yeah, super exciting. And he said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, that's the fire escape." "What's that?" Oh, he said, pointed at the sign. "What's that?" It's a picture of someone running through a door. I said, "That's fire escape." I said, "What do you mean?" And I opened the door and I said, "There's some stairs."
Yeah.
He said, "The lift never worked. If the lift stops working, we go down the stairs." That's disaster planning.
Yeah.
I'm comfortable to live way above where any fire engine can either douse a flame or evacuate me, because there's a set of stairs over there.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, we learned a very, very hard way. You've got to make sure there's a set of stairs with positive air pressure inside it that everyone can get out of the building. And just if you scale that to, okay, so this beautiful kind of almost kind of repurposed lagoon, which is what the Gold Coast is, they just shoved a bunch of sand in it and made canals. This won't be here. Okay, so how can we put what's the fire escape for this bit? Let's just put that bit in there, and then we can all just be, cool, well, we know what's going to happen, and we know what to do if it does.
Yeah.
Cool, carry on.
Yeah.
And that's kind of really it, isn't it?
Yeah. And I'm constantly learning, and there's a phrase that my colleagues use for me, that Lucy's head is full of bees. I'm constantly like, wow, that's so interesting. And I see kind of parallels that nobody else would see. Although I've realized now, sort of living with my dad, that he sees them all the time, and they are incredibly tangential. But one of the things that I learn a lot from actually is I read and learn constantly from things like end of life and palliative care about the delivery of difficult messages. And, because I go to these amazing conferences, you learn things like people with who've been discharged to things like palliative care and hospice care, who are given the plan of how they will be looked after and what their pain management will be, and how often their wonderful nurses will come in, live longer and happier in the period that they are dying in, with the plan. And that was like, wow. And that was a real beautiful moment, I think, for me. And I think also this week we've had major rail strikes here, and people were being interviewed saying, well, they told us they were going to happen. The pandemic helped us to think about our own resilience and working from home. We were ready for them. And, obviously we were sort of engaged with listening about the strikes, but all the emergency planners were messaging each other going, wow, the public, when given the information that they need and a set of fire escapes, and these are where you go for this. And what the panic research suggests, and we hate the word panic in emergency planning, because you don't panic unless the state does something to make you panic. What the research says is that, crowds, for example, will behave very responsibly. They'll look after each other unless you do something to change. You take people in and all of a sudden block off all the exits. Then you create a problem with the dynamics. So a lot of what we can do is about sensible information. I get so many requests on Twitter for tell me what's in a family, emergency grab bag. The torches. We've got hurricane lamps here that don't. This will sound so basic to you guys, but because Australia is often very much ahead, but we have non-power requiring hurricane lamps, and after a power cut earlier this year, we have an off-grid generator and all those sorts of things. But just, making it fun. One of the things that the conference told me yesterday, which I found fascinating, was that more than ever, they're finding that families, when they do lose a loved one, are coming into the funeral directing process with a really clear set of what the person wanted. And the funeral director's theory is that during the pandemic, those slightly more worrying nights, we topped up our glass and we did talk about what you might like if you die. Now, again, that's a symptom of very privileged nation. I had African colleagues ringing me at the start of the pandemic saying, you guys are really going to get your tests now because we've added this to a list of things that might kill us. And you guys are like, what? You mean that life ends in death? This is a shock. So I think, it was a really, I love getting validation of what we think we're seeing anecdotally through studies. And, the funeral directing world saying people are coming in having had the big conversations during the pandemic. And I was like, well, that is interesting. And let's what circumstances do we need? And we like Australia, we have many different religions now. We don't have a huge relationship between religion and politics and policy. So we've become very secular. And one of the big issues in the pandemic was there was nobody having the conversations with the public about what this meant to you emotionally and spiritually. It was all very scientifically driven and very procedural. And I love the idea that maybe coming out of this, we'll have some bigger conversations.
My brain does come up sometimes with slogans, and this one's got a lot of P's in it, but the pathway out of panic is a plan. Once people know what's going on, everyone just chills right out. Well, that's okay, I know what to do. But if no one's saying this is what you do, people panic, and that's when dangerous decisions get made. The other thing that really struck me is that in a previous job, I worked in music television, and we would be on stage in front of sometimes thousands of people. I think the biggest one I ever did was 80,000 people, and I've got a mic. And, we've got bands, and it's all very exciting. And this is at a time in our musical history where there was a lot of jumping off stages and things like that. And so if I'd already seen crowd crushes, and I'd been into crowd crush, and I was really aware of this. And I remember my director telling me, he said, "You've got the mic, so just be careful." I said, "Why is that?" He goes, "They'll do whatever you tell them to do. All right? So if you tell them to dance and look after each other, they'll dance and look after each other. If you tell them to riot, they'll riot." People just need permission to behave. Yeah. That's all people need, is permission to behave. And if you combine those two things, it makes me wonder, Lucy, is there a point, is there a place in our community for not the Prime Minister, not the President, but this is the person who's going to be the one that we look to when things are bad? They are non-partisan, so they are just a person. They don't represent any side of politics, but they are the mum or the dad in the front seat that says, "It's going to be cool, kids. We're just going to go over this bumpy, rocky road for a little bit, and then we'll be sweet. Just roll your windows up because they're going to get a bit dusty." Is there a place for that?
Oh, yes, there is. And I think, probably at one point it probably was provided by organised religion. But, I think there definitely is a place for that. We're always interested in what we call crisis communications, about who's best to deliver the message. We went through a stage of the fire service studies were showing were being the most trusted of the three agencies. But then you would see that, say, with migrant communities who perhaps recently fled civil war, the fire service uniform looked like a military uniform. So there was always, the thing about disaster management is it's a great big net over about 400 different types of social and psychological research. So crisis communication and who delivers it best is this whole field. I actually think it's something I'm very mindful of, because I think what people have done is, in discovering when the dust settles and discovering the disaster planning community, it really struck me that people were desperate for somebody to say this is going to be okay. But also this isn't going to be okay. So later on today, I'm giving a presentation about a resettlement scheme we've been doing here for Ukraine refugees. And what the disaster recovery research shows is that the goodwill lasts about 8 weeks, which is what's happened. And the billeting scheme that we've used, so people having a back bedroom in people's houses, I had predicted would break down in about 8 to 10 weeks. Now, in my old life, pre-Twitter, I would have said all that behind ministerial closed doors and never been able to show that I was accurate. And now I tweet it. So 8 to 10 weeks ago, I tweeted, "This scheme isn't going to work. This is why." But I think one of the things about listening to people like me, like with the cash not stuff, is people go, "Oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense." Now, the difficulty at the early start of the pandemic was there was no plan for a coronavirus that showed, and we did plan for it, there was no plan that showed it would be an 8 to 10 week thing. There was a plan that showed it was 3, possibly more years of initial quite terrible disruption unless there was a vaccine. And really, this would do an awful lot of damage globally to things like economic supply chain. And in the very early days, there was discussion about maybe we could do some broadcast television around that. And maybe there could even be like, hey, there's disaster recovery. These are the things that we think about the pandemic. And there was talk about, going out on our 7 p.m. like magazine shows. And the government came back and said, that's too depressing. People can't cope with that. So that will always be the challenge in disaster recovery. We are, when the disasters happen, suddenly we are like lantern bearers is the phrase that I use. The New Zealanders have some wonderful guidance. It's the first endnote reference in When the Dust Settles, called Leading in Recovery, Companion Through the Chaos. And they merged New Zealand Red Cross, 100 years really of disaster recovery guidance, plus all of their own very painful learning from the 2 earthquakes in 2010, 2011, of course, many other aftershocks, into this one document, which was like, this is painful. This is an endurance event. This is incredibly long. And what we find is people who are going through disaster aftermath go, wow, that's everything I felt. But it's incredibly hard, again, as we've said all the way through today, to sell it in advance, that these are the things you need to do. But I would say that's where I'm going to spend the rest of my career, is sort of, there's a strength in being ready.
Part of your job has taken you to places where you're in a room with tens, 20s, if not hundreds of victims of a disaster. Some of them may be full humans. Some of them may be, let's be honest, after particularly like a plane crash or something, parts of humans. How do you go from being the effective person that you are there, doing your job, doing the best you can, trying to be of as much service to the families of those victims, to then in your car on the way home, and then, Mum, what's for dinner? Like, how do you get there, and how do you look after yourself?
There's plenty of textbooks that sort of set out this is how you do it, but I wanted people to see a different side of this, that you're constantly calibrating, you're getting it wrong. I got it wrong even this week, because I've been away for work all of last week, and I was quite punchy when I came home. I'm more directional when I come home, and that's not going to work in your own kitchen. So you're constantly evaluating. There's no, you get to see a lot of my mistakes. One of my big mistakes in family life is I sort of try and rush people, I think, to a place where it's going to be okay quicker than they're ready to. And I really explore that in the book. So I think one thing I would, I would say, and as I say, I've just come back from a big conference of funeral directors. They completely got where I was coming from when I say in the book, I've always thought of the dead body, however damaged, I'm talking very, very small pieces sometimes, however damaged, as my kin. It doesn't revolt me or doesn't terrify me. And I hadn't really expected that to be a controversial line, but it has been a line that people have really questioned. Again, I think it comes from, particularly in Western nations, the sequestering of the dead body. I find when I'm with friends in the agricultural community who've perhaps seen terrible accidents, or they obviously deal with life and death cycles all the time, are more comfortable with some of the things I've obviously seen. But this is also, a world where we just don't see that level of destruction. We don't even really see illness at its most grim often. Often that's all moved behind closed doors. So I think that's really interested me, that people have been particularly sort of surprised by that. The other thing I think is that people are looking for me to be traumatized. When I'm in my book signing queues, you can tell people like, is she drunk right now? Like, how is she coping with this? And what I've used, all the way through, I was very lucky, I think, that my career, I had a number of American mentors, and you would just access psychological support. And I have very good trauma debriefing, but also it's a spectrum of support. So it starts with welfare and resources and taking time out and recognizing your body and recognizing yourself. I've made a big thing in a lot of the media that I've done recently about the role of the planthem, as we mentioned, which is the music that gets a lot of us through. And that's really caught imagination. And it turns out, in the tribe, that we've all been using music as disaster planners. And one of the things I've really learned sometimes is the power of going away. I found it very hard in the pandemic to work from home. We were particularly doing a lot of what's called excess death planning and mortuary planning. And exactly as you describe, I came out of my upstairs office, came downstairs, and both kids were literally at the bottom of the stairs saying, "What's for tea?" And what I learned early on was I was going to have to separate home and work during the pandemic, as I'd always done. That's been a big thing for me. And what I call the kind of demobbing. So I like it when there's a journey. I get, for reasons I explain in the book, I get driven a lot. So coming home is really important to me via a journey, and I play my music. But I have a family that keep me so grounded, and they're very quick to say, you've got kind of computer face, you're not paying attention, Mum. So, but yeah, I've always seen it as a privilege.
I get told that. I know that.
Yeah.
Computer face. I know exactly the one. Yeah, you've had an extraordinary career, and the benefit that you have given the victims and the future victims of all these disasters is immeasurable. When you see in the aftermath of disaster people who do not know each other help each other, what does that do for you?
That's how I manage to do my work. It's always a privilege. You see amazing things, and humans are great. And I think that a lot of the climate discussions are injected with this fear and this uncertainty. And, I planned for a pandemic for 15 years, and then I saw it. And, I saw a very different one, I think, to other people, because I just constantly saw, as you say, humans looking out for humans. We will be okay. And, I have huge, huge faith in that. There will be dark times, and there will be good times. There will be the disaster, and there will be the rebuilding. And the individual amounts of survivance, which is coming through these things, I write about this a lot, with not just getting through, but coming through with humour. One of the greatest things of my job is the amount of humour that you see community to community. People think we use gallows humour as responders, or it's never dark humour. I don't use that at all. What makes me laugh harder than I'll laugh at anything else is humour within a community. So, things like the You're from Christchurch campaign, which was all about sort of making light of some of the building challenges. And it was so, so needed, the smiles. And so I think it will be okay alongside this huge amount of work that we've got to do before and during. So, yeah, it's I call myself a pessimistic optimist.
I love it. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you, and I'm really grateful that you took the time today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Absolutely.